5 or 6 months in, it was clear that people just wanted to blow up everything that wasn't working. They wanted to quit their spouses, they wanted to quit their city, they wanted to quit their job, relocate their home.
You get to a certain age and you feel like there's no change, that you kind of forget that it is possible to do things that make you happy.
At some point, I know I'm going to retire, either a forced retirement or I'm going to decide to retire myself. I always tinkered with bicycles since I was 10 years old.
I felt such trepidation about going back to the same routine I had been in pre-pandemic, and I thought, no, I'm not going back.
I was fired because I was sick with COVID.
Why do we have to go back to the 9 to 5?
COVID highlighted that the industry is not well equipped to be able to support through challenges.
There's not going to be another moment like this. It's a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity.
No, I'm not made for this. I have to try different things.
I'd like seeing my kid get off the bus 1 or 2 days a week.
I have to start all over to rebuild everything.
I'm Stephanie Leydon. I'm the Director of Special Projects at GBH News. Welcome to tonight's forum, Power Shift, How the Big Quit is Shaping the Future of Work. Coming up, we'll take as many of your questions as we can, and we invite you to join us for a special bonus session at 7:30, where you'll be able to share your big quit stories. But first, I'd like to introduce our panel tonight. Leslie Forde is the founder of Mom's Hierarchy of Needs, and she has used research to inform growth and innovation strategy for over 20 years. She also launched the Allies at Work program to help employers retain working parents and create inclusive workspaces where caregivers can thrive. Leslie, thanks for being here tonight. Also with us is Dr. Mark Melnick. Mark is the Director of Economic and Public Policy Research at the UMass Donahue Institute. He specializes in demographic, socioeconomic, and labor market issues, and he leads a 15-person team working on economic and public policy research projects that inform clients in government, private industry, and nonprofit sectors. Mark, it's great to have you. And rounding off our panel tonight is Lauren Jones. She's the Executive Vice President at the Massachusetts Business Roundtable. That's a public policy organization comprised of executives from some of the state's largest employers. And as part of her portfolio, Lauren leads workforce development policy and strategy for the Roundtable. Lauren, Mark, Leslie, welcome to all of you. Thanks so much for being here tonight. I thought we would set up the discussion by sharing a little bit of our reporting on what we've been calling the Big Quit. We've been chronicling the stories of people from all walks of life who've made major changes during the pandemic. They're the real people behind these record-setting quit rates you've heard about. And GBH News senior producer Emily Judum has put together this short video so you can get a sense of how this pandemic has changed people's priorities and expectations.
It has been 2 years since the World Health Organization declared COVID-19 a global pandemic.
People just wanted to blow up everything that wasn't working.
Make sure you practice social distancing.
They wanted to quit their spouses, they wanted to quit their city, they wanted to quit their job.
I was definitely burning out.
I was tearing myself apart with my own schedule.
I didn't want a job where I was sitting in front of a computer.
We don't want to go back to trying to succeed in a system that wasn't really rigged for our success.
I felt such trepidation about going back to the same routine I had been in pre-pandemic, and I thought, no, I'm not going back.
The gift of time and self-reflection has enabled me to make a really significant change in my life.
I'm relying on myself here. I'm not getting my weekly check.
I didn't have a choice but to leave my job because I had no childcare for my daughter. I got one of the last rental cars and came back to Cape Cod, and it sort of started percolating this idea of like, oh, I don't think I want to live in New York anymore.
I sat down and said, what am I really going to do in retirement?
I thought, I'm either going to wake up and I'm going to be 80 years old and think, wow, I should have done that, or I'm just going to go do it.
Seeing your business, something that you made, your brand, on paper, it's like surreal.
Yes. All right, ready? Going through this pandemic and really these awful times has really pushed me to truly understand that life really is too short and you have to do what you love.
I want to go back to school to become a software engineer.
I really actually decided to go and start studying for law school back in March.
Every bone rolling through. The old systems are clearly not working. So if we're going to rebuild it anyway, now's our chance to kind of rise from the ashes.
And by the way, some of those people you just met in the video are in our audience with us tonight. We thank them for being here, and we invite you to stick around and meet them after our panel discussion. Also, we have heard from people all across the region who have written in or called about their big quits. If you're one of those people and you're in our audience tonight, feel free to drop us a comment or a question in the Q&A and let us know that you have shared your big quit. We'd love to acknowledge you. But let's talk about what's next. Offices are reopening. Traffic is coming back. From Amazon to Starbucks to neighborhood grocery stores, service workers are unionizing. Help wanted signs are everywhere. Mark Melnick, I wonder if we can start with you, because I know you've been tracking the numbers. You've been looking at the job openings versus the number of jobs that are being filled. And I wonder if you can tell us what you're seeing and what this may mean for workers and workplaces.
Sure, absolutely. So first, thanks for having me this evening. This was a really exciting topic to get to discuss with you all. And one of the things that I do as part of my work at the Donahue Institute is we talk a lot about the different economic issues that are taking place in Massachusetts. And I'll go out usually once a month or a couple times a month and do what we call the road show. And in January, February, March of 2020, I joked with my staff, but the roadshow was getting boring. And be careful what you wish for, because the economic conditions changed so dramatically over the next couple of years. And Stephanie, your setup was wonderful with that when you start talking about not just the big quit, but then also these other issues that we're seeing in terms of unionization and other elements of just the ways in which the economy is changing so dramatically. And so when we think about, and I know we'll have plenty of time to talk about different issues in the next hour, but when we talk about the big quit, one of the things that we saw very dramatically over the course of particularly 2021 was this spike in the number of workers who were disconnecting from their jobs. It was actually the highest quit rate both nationally and in Massachusetts in recorded history. And so this is where we got a lot of energy around this notion of people, the great resignation or quitting, or however we refer to it. What's been telling about it, though, has been the degree to which we've seen worker empowerment in this. And I think one of the things that's been misstated a little bit when we think about the big quit isn't so much that people are permanently leaving the labor force. And in fact, at a talk I gave on Friday, it said it wasn't so much that people don't want to work, it's that I don't want to work for you. And that workers were deciding that, hey, especially as the economy picked back up, there was the opportunity for workers to go and find opportunities that have more flexibility, higher pay. So I think the degree of free agency that we're seeing from workers is both the combination of the things that you were seeing in the video about folks saying, reevaluating their relationship to work and thinking like, well, are these hours quite right for me? Is this a passion for me? But then this other part, which is that employees are saying, these conditions aren't flexible enough for me, or the wages aren't high enough. We've seen wages go up for workers. And in particular, the big quit has been most acute in those industries that are lowest pay. So we're seeing a lot of a lot of free agency among workers in low wage sectors. And I think just kind of highlighting the fact that in tight labor market conditions, and that's what we're in, workers have a certain level of power now that they didn't have necessarily before. Now, I could speak a little bit more as we go on through the evening about why I think that empowerment may be sticky, in part because of just changing demographics in Massachusetts and the nation in general. But I think, when we think about the big quit, there's two big things happening there. There's the cultural part about thinking about work, but then there's also just the basic economics of with less workers and or that as employers were trying to fill more roles, workers had some level of agency in order to be selective. And we've seen it translate in both people changing jobs, but wages going up.
And when you say wages going up, are you talking about service workers? Because that's a lot of the big quit was in the industries where service workers have been employed and decided they didn't want to be anymore. And that's the industries where we're seeing the unionization. So are we seeing a wage growth there, Mark, real quickly? And then I'll jump over to Lauren.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, wages are growing across the economy. Now, of course, the problem is, it's not keeping up with where inflation is right now. So the experiences of households aren't necessarily, the buying power is less than you would have had 2 years ago, but the premiums, at least for workers, have gone up. It does mean less to the household's bottom line. And the inflation story is a whole other piece that we can get into later this evening.
Right. A whole other talk, I think. Lauren, I can imagine that over at the Mass Business Roundtable, there's a lot of discussion about how to retain and attract workers. Mark is talking about sort of this stickiness of potential of the power that workers now are enjoying. What are you seeing, and are companies adapting? Are they changing to accommodate this new perspective on work?
That's a great question. Talent has long been a top priority for members of the roundtable. I think during the pandemic, that need to find talent, the need to retain talent has continued to be top of mind, has been compounded by the complexities of these new work environments that we're finding ourselves in. I'm glad that we started the discussion, though, with some stories, because at the end of the day, I think what employers are also realizing is there's a human element to all of this. And many of our members have talked about the need to lead with empathy. And I think realize that to be able to retain the talent that they have, as well as to attract new talent, they have to think about the needs of the employees that they already have, as well as the needs of potential job seekers that they want to bring into the door. And so recognizing there's a whole new element of what it takes to attract and retain talent and even develop talent. I think companies are recognizing that the ways that things were, the way that things were in January, February of 2020 or before is no longer. And there is certainly power that employees and job seekers have in order to attract and retain and develop that talent.
I'd like to bring Leslie Forde in because, Leslie, you, as part of your work with Mom's Hierarchy of Needs, have been surveying parents. And if anyone was hit hard during this pandemic, it's been parents who had to figure out how to work and take care of kids when daycares and schools closed down. And it's been just such an extraordinary disruption. 2,000 parents you've been surveying since March of 2020. I wonder, are they feeling the benefits of what Lauren is talking about, this more empathetic approach to employment?
So it's an excellent question. So yes and no. I'll give you kind of both sides of the answer. At an individual level, employees, workers, and particularly workers who are in historically overlooked groups. My study indexes very heavily on mothers and women, people of color, people who have not traditionally been in the leadership roles. In my study are still not feeling a great deal of personal power to negotiate a change. So there's a question where we ask, do you feel comfortable asking your manager for what you really need? And only 3% say that they are. That psychological safety still isn't there for historically overlooked groups. However, I think what's changed is the number of and level of options. So instead of having a really awkward discussion with your manager that you really don't want to have and don't think that you're going to win, you can just look for another job. And that's what's happening. So if people feel that they cannot effectively set boundaries at work or maintain boundaries at work or navigate politics at work, instead of kind of dealing with it, which they might have done several years ago, or trying to have a protracted negotiation to change it, they say, you know what, I can upgrade and this is the perfect time. So that's how I'm seeing that power exercised. And to your point and Lauren's about what's available, more employers than ever are paying attention to family benefits, benefits for caregivers, flexibility in terms of location and even hours. Those are parameters that used to be pretty fixed in a lot of professions. And suddenly people feel like they have room to make some different choices, which I think overall is super exciting.
When you say, these benefits that relate to caregiving, are we talking about, daycare provided at the office? Because that's a pretty, I think that was a pretty rare perk pre-2020.
It's still a pretty rare perk. Like less than 10% of workers have access to that, like extremely rare. But the options are broader now. So more employers, it's still not the majority, but a more significant minority are subsidizing the cost of childcare or daycare. I saw pretty early in the study that for people who were in essential work roles, like people who worked in hospitals, teachers, their employers were taking extra measures to provide them with childcare, particularly for folks who were in hospitals and medical settings. So employers have always had a little bit of, they've had their toes in the water on care for a long time. A lot of organizations have offered backup childcare, recognizing that if your primary care falls through, like your sitter is sick or daycare is closed, that happens frequently enough for parents that providing an alternative was, a mutual benefit. But, backup care is more than just backup care now, right? In the pandemic, people have lost childcare for months at a time. And although childcare was pretty hard to find, especially affordable childcare, there's now a huge childcare shortage, particularly in Massachusetts, but also in other places. So employers realize that if they don't take some creative measures to support workers with childcare or elder care, that it doesn't really serve anyone.
Because they've got to do their jobs. Lauren, are there any, before we jump back to Mark on a larger question of kind of filling the gaps with workers, Lauren, are there any tangible things that you're seeing employers do that they weren't doing 2020 or that they're moving toward doing now?
Absolutely. I think just on the heels of the conversation around early childcare, the Roundtable helped to launch the Massachusetts Business Coalition on Early Childhood Education. And it actually is comprised of about 85 plus employers across the Commonwealth who are coming together to advocate for more accessible childcare, more affordable childcare. And so while there are some employers that are thinking about what does this mean within my workplace, we also have employers using a megaphone to really speak to the need that we have statewide and with the state infrastructure for enhancing early childcare services and the system. And the legislature is very much a partner in that kind of reform. But I think also you have employers that are talking about, as well as walking the walk and implementing new ways of working when it comes to mental health in the workplace, when it comes to work-life balance, so that the childcare as well as elder care or any other kind of self-care can be recognized and appreciated. So when someone's showing up physically in the office or on a Zoom or a virtual platform, people recognize that there's more to it, and there's a recognition that they're going to put the work in. They're going to be very productive employees and workers, but they may also have other responsibilities as long as they are maintaining that high productivity. I think employers are realizing how valuable that is, and that they can also elevate conversations on other needs and benefits that job seekers and employees need today that they may not have needed before. That's also important. And
So
I would just say,
go ahead.
I would just say a part of all of this and why employers are realizing the value for this is to maintain competitiveness. It's to maintain competitiveness for the employer and how they're attracting and retaining talent. But I think also, competitiveness here in Massachusetts, because if we don't have employers thinking differently in how they're going to attract and retain the talent here in Massachusetts, or attract and retain talent in our own backyards for companies that are from the Berkshires to the Cape and in between, then there's a threat there as well for where that talent may choose to go, because we are increasingly mobile as a result of the pandemic.
Right. I mean, you can work anywhere, right? You could be in Boston and work for a company overseas, or vice versa. You could live in a cheaper place. Right. And Mark, I think that brings us back to some of your research. I mean, yes, companies can adapt to these new priorities workers have, but there's a finite number of workers. And I wonder if you can talk a little bit about what the big economic picture is. If you've got so many open jobs and employers cannot fill them, what happens, and where do we get workers to fill those jobs, or how do employers get those workers at this point?
Right. And Lauren set that part of the conversation up really well, talking about competitiveness. I think one of the critical things that was forgotten over the course of the pandemic, over the last decade or so, longer, labor economists have been talking about concerns of labor shortages in the future, particularly as it related to the impending retirements of the baby boomers and now at this stage, old Gen Xers. I'm a young Gen Xer in my mid-40s, but older Gen Xers are folks who are in their mid to late 50s. So the pandemic happens, everybody freaks out, the world stops. But one thing that definitely happened was we kept getting older. Right. So then, so one of the things that we're having happen that's overlapping with all the challenges that happened with COVID is that we already had an aging labor force. We had an aging labor force in New England. We have one in Massachusetts, and we have one nationally. It's more acute in New England. But what it sets up is this related to Lauren's points, is that there is a competitiveness as it relates to a flexible work environment that is created through the future of work. But there's also a competitiveness issue of just simply not having as many workers to fill the roles necessary for an economy to grow. So right now in Massachusetts, we're about 20,000 working age adults below where we were pre-pandemic. We're about 14,000 people in the labor force below where we were pre-pandemic. If you look at a line of our workforce size over the last 30 years, it goes straight up, right? What happens in the pandemic, though, it blips down, and then now it's been kind of flat and coming up slower. We should have had a larger labor force. Instead, we have a smaller one now. And the primary concern is that we are as baby boomers reach retirement ages, as Gen Xers reach retirement ages, do we have enough people coming up the ranks to fill the job openings that we need? So it's a short-term problem now, but a long-term problem. So my colleagues at Mass Benchmarks, we track, which is the journal that focuses on the Massachusetts economy, we think we're years away from recovering all the jobs lost during the recession. And the reason isn't because the economy isn't growing. It's because you can't fill a job if there isn't a worker there to fill it. And right now, as our age profile shifts a little bit older, we run into this risk of not having enough labor to fill opportunities for growth. Now, a couple other things about the pandemic that were critical. One was in this most recent year, 2021, was the first year in Massachusetts history that we had more deaths than we had births. That is partly a function of a pandemic, and it's also a function of an aging population. Secondly, we had a dramatic decline over the last 5 years in immigrant, net international migration. Immigrant labor has been central to the story of economic growth in Massachusetts for decades. Since 1990, 80% of the labor force growth in Massachusetts is because of the growth of foreign-born labor. But during the Trump administration in particular, with changes in policy and kind of rhetoric around immigration, coupled with a global pandemic that really stopped the flow of people moving from overseas, dramatically impacts Massachusetts' economy. So part of what you're raising now is a relationship between short-term and long-term issues, because we have a smaller labor force now than we did pre-pandemic, and the demographic trends for Massachusetts are such that we are at risk of having a smaller labor, not having enough labor to grow the economy the way we want to going ahead. So being competitive is central. It is having employers that are flexible. It is being proactive with public policy so that we're building housing, so the quality of life in Massachusetts is at a high quality. We have some of the highest housing prices in the country. That's been an issue for a long time. And it's being able to find labor in places where that have been non-traditional in the past, meaning older workers staying in the labor force longer, finding more job sharing opportunities for working mothers, helping with folks who were previously incarcerated and increasing their labor force participation. Proactive thinking about workforce development is going to be central to economic growth for Massachusetts over the next 20 to 30 years.
Mark, that's fascinating when you're talking about a shrinking labor pool, which could impact the economy. You're saying that we have traditionally relied on immigrants to fill jobs, and that population is not what technically the economy needs. And so it's creating opportunities for other people and that other groups of people. And that leads into a couple of questions we're getting from the audience. Gail asks, is the big quit also happening with older workers? And here from Maddie, in all of this mess, how are we to think about the workplace as we age and missing a generation from the workforce that would help preserve social security and other benefits? So there's sort of two things in there, and maybe this is a question for you as well, Mark. Is an effort being made to retain older workers, and what happens, to your point, when we lose all these workers to people who are heading into their retirement years and relying on Social Security?
Right. So, and again, these were the public policy things we were talking about a decade ago. And they just they lost steam because, for obvious reasons, the pandemic took up a lot of the emotional energy around public policy. Now, the first question about, are we seeing a big quit with older workers? Yes, we saw an increase in retirement right near the pandemic, and it makes sense. You had older folks who may be more vulnerable, people who are kind of on the line a little bit about maybe I'll retire, maybe I won't, and saying, you know what, that's fine. I'm worried about my own safety. Working remotely is maybe tough for me for whatever reason, and these folks pulling out of the labor market in general. In terms of the bigger public policy thing about Social Security, this has been what has been underpinning the debate nationally around Social Security for the last 20 years or longer, of what's going to happen when this glut of baby boomers move into retirement ages, and with life expectancy traditionally increasing, although the last couple of years we actually had a slight decrease in life expectancy. And that's something that we have not adequately solved And one of the big concerns I have, and it relates a lot to some of the some of the childcare issues even before, is that COVID, pivoting back to COVID, was a great revealer of a lot of elements of social inequality. But are we thinking proactively about infrastructure as it relates to supporting families and supporting households in general? That could be when we talk about Social Security and retirement, but it could be other elements of infrastructure too when we think about early childhood education or cost of childcare and so on. And I'm a little bit concerned the way the debate has kind of devolved over the last year, that we kind of started settling back into same old conversations as opposed to thinking about or remaking and using COVID as the impetus for thinking proactively about public policy. I think at the state level, we're thinking in a very smart way. I get concerned that at the national, we're not. And that could take us in a different direction altogether. But I think those are some of the things that at least percolated in my mind as I listened to the other panelists talk this evening.
Yeah, I think that's maybe the hope, the expectation that there will be some real change. But you talk about existing trends being exacerbated by the pandemic, right? People retiring, having enough younger workers, something that was exacerbated by the pandemic. Leslie, what kind of trends, working with parents and working with employers as you have for so long, what kind of trends have you seen exacerbated over the last 2 years relating to workers and employers?
Well, it's been really interesting. So one of the trends that's been exacerbated is just the fact that a lot of employers are not necessarily prepared to handle planned, let alone unplanned leaves. So you have a lot of people, in addition to parents, who have been managing some of the challenges that I referenced earlier with childcare and with elder care. You have a lot of people who became accidental caregivers during the pandemic, for themselves, for partners, for, aging family members or not aging family members dealing with long haul COVID. So, navigating the challenges of care and integrating that and normalizing it within the workforce, I think there's an incredible opportunity to do so. But that trend, how well organizations are prepared for that, how well organizations support parental leaves and returns to work, whether it's from a parental leave or, as more organizations I'm seeing are actively developing programs and cultivating returnships. To Mark's point about the labor shortage, looking at those workers who might have traditionally been overlooked because they've been out of the labor force for a while, often because of caregiving responsibilities, how to court them and bring them back in. So I see that it's a more progressive work policies, benefits. Employers are also paying more attention to diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. And I think that is also part of this retention need, right? In a labor shortage scenario where a lot of people are competing for top talent, if you're hiring people who are historically overlooked and they are like revolving out of the door 2 or 3 years later, that's an expense for employers. That's a challenge for culture. So I see employers, and again, I think this is very positive, because work didn't work for a lot of people before. So they're starting to dig deeper on, who's getting promoted? Why is that person getting promoted? How do we make people feel seen and included and, like they are part of the organization? So a lot of those softer, I think, aspects that really underpin a strong culture and make workers feel like they want to stay, regardless of whether their comp is the highest or not, organizations are paying attention to that, in addition to the benefits that we mentioned earlier.
And Lauren, are you also seeing, Leslie mentioned, workers who may have left the workforce for childcare. We've talked about older workers, recruiting them, getting them back into the workforce. Are there other groups that in this very tight labor market are being courted and that employers are reaching out to in new ways and maybe creating new opportunities for because of the labor shortage?
Yeah, I think over the past 2 years, just to connect back to the point earlier around inequities, I think employers have recognized health inequities brought on by the pandemic or exacerbated by the pandemic. And then also, as Leslie mentioned, the call to action from the business community on diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I think as a result, employers are being more intentional, growing in their DEI strategies, renewing, enhancing, or just getting started in some cases, how to best attract diverse talent. And Leslie used a great word, belonging, recognizing that I think employers realize it's not just putting out a statement, it's not just saying we need more diversity, but realizing that there's a huge strategy that needs to be invested in to ensure that there's equity in the workplace, that all employees feel included, and there's a sense of that belonging in the culture that many of these employers for your office type jobs have had to invest in the past 2 years, and very virtual dynamic. And now with some of those employers bringing employees back in the workplace, with some now also remote or some hybrid, there's an added complexity to how this sense of culture in an office, physically or virtually, can be achieved. And I think making sure that groups that may have been most vulnerable during this past 2 years feel that sense of belonging. And I think also for companies that are just getting started on a DEI journey, that they have to recognize it is a journey, and that it takes a lot of investment in time, and culture is a huge part of that.
Lauren, are you seeing evidence of people really committing to sort of a hybrid culture and being able to build what you're talking about in terms of a work culture that is inclusive? I mean, that is a huge challenge, I would think, to figure out new ways of working and to build those bonds when part of it is virtual, or maybe all of it is virtual.
Yeah, I know some of our members are wrestling with this very topic, thinking about equity and what that means when you have some employees coming in on varying days. There may be a hybrid schedule for a certain team, and there may be differences within even a department. And what does that mean? Or what does that mean where someone may have been in person 2 years ago and is now totally remote? And how do you provide that sense of democratization that employees may have felt in a virtual environment over the past 2 years? There was a different culture where you're able to chat in the Zoom chat or speak up, in a company town hall that was run virtually. How does that continue to translate in a hybrid work environment? How does that continue to translate as employees return to the office? And I just think there's a better sense of awareness and value of culture, and that employers are trying to ensure that they do it right. And I think we're also mindful, or employers are mindful, that there's a lot of best practices out there of people who have done it well before the pandemic, and learning from colleagues within the business community. Because I think with all these changes in the workplace, one thing I've noticed employers realize that it's best to look at what other companies are doing as much as what they're doing as well, because we've all had to navigate in so many new norms. And it's valuable to be able to see what's happening not only within your industry, but across industries, as well as across sizes of companies too.
I want to remind the audience that you can put some questions you may have in the Q&A, and we'll try to get to those. We've got a number of them coming in. Okay, this is from Bill. How permanent do panelists think that the newfound job benefits, flexibility, higher wages, etc., will be? Mark, you used the word sticky before. Are you confident that that these changes are here to stay, that workers will retain some level of power in this equation?
No, I mean, I think it's a great question, and I think, one of the things that has really stood out throughout the pandemic is just the challenge of being able to predict what was next. When we step back 2 years and think about where we were pre-pandemic, but then like what every 4 to 6 months were. I mean, it's been an incredible time period, really. You think about like the George Floyd murder happens in the middle of 2020, right? And so like we're barely in the pandemic, and then we have this incredible racial reckoning happening at the same time. Then we have the election and everything that's been happening this year, Ukraine and so on. So I think there are certain elements of this that are hard to define the stickiness when you talk about like, well, what is the wage? What's going to happen with wages going forward? Simple economics says that if you have a smaller labor supply, then there's just going to be increased demand for that labor. So one would think that would have positive benefits on wages long term. But capitalism is an evolving creature, right? And so how you find different ways to create labor, that will be a factor in what we see with wages and so on. In terms of flexibility with workers and hybrid work, again, I think it's a little bit hard to define what that future looks like. I'd love to, come back in a year or two and see like how this kind of seeps into the DNA of work cultures in general. I mean, a year ago at this time, we were 100% remote. We're walking into a world where cities don't matter anymore, and it's going to be 100% remote and so on. And I never really bought that. I always felt like the future was probably going to be some sort of hybrid model, and I think that's kind of what we're heading towards. I think the future looks like a 3 and 2 in the office, or a 2 and 3 kind of thing, or employers looking more to be flexible in those ways, but maintaining some on-site type of presence. So I think that to me is the part that ends up being sticky. But like, there's a lot of things that can evolve over time with this stuff that I feel like it's still too early to tell when we're talking about like what the future of work is in terms of remote, or how place changes. We were talking, again, folks were talking in 2020 about the death of cities, and I feel like that was wildly overstated. But like, where are we going to be in 2024 and 2025? Those are tougher things to really be able to tell right now. But I do think we're in an evolutionary period for sure. And I mean, even before pandemic, I served on the governor's future transportation task force or commission, excuse me. And we were talking about remote work as a way of solving the transportation problems in Massachusetts. And, I'll admit, I kind of rolled my eyes at that and saying like, yeah, that sounds great, but I just don't see us like roundly doing remote work as a labor force. I think the culture isn't there. Well, when the culture gets forced on you, then things shift, right? So I think that's a long-winded way of saying, it's hard to know which elements of these things are going to stick going forward. There are some statistical things that'll just point to, hey, labor force is going to be smaller, and workers have certain things that they expect now as it relates to flexibility. And I would expect those things to at least stick in the medium term.
Yeah, I mean, who could have imagined it? 128 at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, or going through the city on 93 at 6 o'clock, being able to do that without traffic. I mean, I think what happened over the last 2 years was really unimaginable before March of 2020. Leslie, maybe you can answer this question from Ed. In your work as a consultant to companies, your allies at work efforts, Ed asks, how have managers changed their working styles to accommodate remote and hybrid? Have you gotten a sense of that in your work?
Oh, it's a good question. Unfortunately, not all managers have changed their working styles, right? And the working style does need to be different. I think the managers that get it and that have been successful with the transition are paying much more attention to being transparent with their communications and being really clear about what they mean, being much more, I think, sensitive and empathetic to the mental health crisis that's raging in the background of all of this. I mean, one of the early themes that kind of surfaced in the research study that I conduct is just how, people were besides themselves about their children's mental health and their own mental health. And there's a lack of providers and a lack of good options with this huge crisis raging. So managers that check in on their people, ask about them in the one-on-one before just kind of diving into the work of the day. Managers that frankly respect people's off time. I mean, we had reached a point in our culture where overwork and working to the point of burnout was glamorized. So, I tell managers, it's like, you might like to work at 10 o'clock at night, and that's okay, but your people don't need to know that. You can schedule that email to go during business hours. People are so burned out. They don't want to log back on and monitor email after their children have gone to sleep or after they've had dinner. But the culture in the organization has a big impact on that. If the culture is that 10 people are going to reply all after a manager sends a message at 10 o'clock at night, or a manager reaches out on Slack off hours on the weekend, and that fantastic assignment that everybody wants is being assigned off hours, it's going to persist this culture where people feel like they have to be always on. So I really work closely with organizations to create a more inclusive culture, which means like creating an equitable opportunity for people to participate at work and not penalize people who might have caregiving responsibilities that are incredibly demanding outside of work.
It's also tempting with those phones, right, Leslie? It's just so easy to send a message on Slack or to send an email. And that's some good advice about maybe not doing that, right? In the evenings and in the weekends.
Or scheduling it so no one knows.
That's the solution. Interesting question from Joe. Maybe this is a good one for Lauren. How have workers who were forced into remote arrangements by COVID responded to new measurements to put in place to keep track of what they're doing? And will this measurement regime last? I think he's talking about monitoring, right? This is a way that employers, I suppose, have tried to keep track of what people are doing when they're not in the office. Have you seen this in use, Lauren? And do you think it will remain so if it is in use?
Yeah, what I've seen is probably not in the details of what our employers are seeing day to day, but kind of at a high level, we've heard in surveying our members during the course of the past 2 years that employers are seeing their employees at high rates of productivity. And I think it really is going to be on a case-by-case basis within the work environment or within the certain company on how that productivity is defined, but there is, there is satisfactory or even beyond satisfactory achievement that employers are seeing in these remote times or these new work environments. I think some employers also recognize that, because of other responsibilities at the home, work in a remote work environment, what may have been, the 9 to 5 before is not as necessary as long as they're getting the work done. And so if it means that they're clocking in at 10 to 6, or they're going to have to take a break to go pick up their kids, and then they're going to come back online, if that is what works for them to be productive, then, I think some employers are thinking that that is okay because they want to make sure that at the end of the day, their employees are productive, the work is getting done, and that they are able to accommodate perhaps a new set of needs that employees have in their remote workplace that they did not have previously. And to stay flexible.
Stephanie, can I shoot in there with that too?
Absolutely.
I think,
Mark, yes.
Yeah, I mean, what's interesting to me, sitting in this spot, because you guys asked me to be here because of the economic research, but when you introduced before, I have 15 staff, I actually have 20. So I'm also an employer, separate from analyzing this, externally from a macro level. And I think from my perch, like I've been wonderfully satisfied with where our productivity was. Now we've had a lot of, it's intellectual labor. You can analyze data from anywhere on Earth. But one of the things for me was wanting to afford flexibility to staff. We always had a certain level of it, but we've been able to increase that level of flexibility. And I think even me as the manager, I have 2 young children. One of the things that our quality of life actually went up in the pandemic once the stress of the pandemic went away. The ability to, as Lauren was mentioning, to go pick up the kids, to leave a little bit early so that I can take, them to their lessons or whatever the thing is. And, really instilling that kind of culture within the team that, hey, that's fun. Just get your work done. I'm not watching what time you're logged on or what time you log off. It does run into that problem that Leslie highlights where, as a result, some of my emails do come at 10 o'clock, but my team also knows that my kid had a piano lesson and so I dipped, early so I could take her to her piano lesson. And then now I'm logging back in to catch up on a couple of things I missed while I did that. So, not all work can do this, right? There's service-based work that is a face-to-face component. So there is a certain level of elitism about the kinds of industries that have that kind of flexibility baked into them. But there is improved quality of life on the other side of that. And I think as an employer, that's one of the things that I wanted to provide that to my staff because I want it for myself. And, recognizing that and sharing that across our team. And granted, and it's only 20 folks, right? So it's easier to build that kind of culture amongst 20 humans than maybe some, Amazon or some giant place like that. But, it's worked really well for us.
And I think that's sort of the difficulty of this. I'm sorry, somebody say. Leslie?
No, I was just going to put an exclamation mark on a point that Mark said. Like, I think we're talking about kind of the office work environment and the changes within that for remote workers or hybrid. But I do want to acknowledge a point that Mark said. This is not the case for all workers. And when you think about some job seekers or workers that are trying to get a job or trying to upskill, there's a whole other set of challenges that come with it, especially when they may be juggling childcare, transportation, or other work supports for them to be able to show up for the job or to be able to access and retain a job training program to then be able to be part of a job in the future. And so I just want to recognize that because I know a lot of we've talked about and our members are mostly of the office or the lab and manufacturing space, but there is a whole other subset, a huge subset of our economy that is within the service industry that is also for job seekers in the labor market that are trying to access these job opportunities. And there are a lot of things that they're navigating as well and needs that they have too.
It is not one size fits all. We unbelievably are at time. I have one last quick question. I guess it's going to be a yes or a no. Will we at this moment, when workers are empowered and are demanding change and employers need workers, is this the moment we move to a 4-day work week? What do you think, Mark?
So as we did in the warm-up, I said I was worried that my staff would be watching, so then I would be committed to whatever the answer is. I think that I don't
One word, maybe?
No, sorry.
No. Okay, Lauren, yes or no? 4-day work week ahead?
It will depend on the employer.
Okay, Leslie, yes or no? 4-day work week in our futures?
Maybe. I don't think it's works for every industry, but I've seen a lot of promising studies about it and other countries have adopted it successfully.
We shall see. I think we'll have to reconvene a year from now and see where we're at. Leslie Forde from the Mom's Hierarchy of Needs, Lauren Jones from the Massachusetts Business Roundtable, and Mark Melnick from the Donahue Institute at UMass Amherst. Thank you all. Terrific panel, terrific insights. Really appreciate your time. There is more ahead this evening, but first we have a quick message from our fundraising team. GBH News is a public service, and we present it to everyone free of charge. And we do invite you to visit wgbh.org/support events to show your support in any amount, or you can simply click on the link in the chat tab, and we appreciate you considering that. There is a bonus session in which we will have the opportunity to continue this conversation, hear from members of our audience, hear from some of the people we've profiled that you met earlier on in our discussion. And the address for that Zoom chat, you may have it in your email if you've already registered. Otherwise, it is in the chat, and you can head over there to share your story. I'd like to leave you with another one of our stories from our series, The Big Quit. This is Alyssa Wilson of Dorchester, who took a big leap of faith to focus on her own business. I'm Stephanie Leydon with GBH News. Thanks again for being here. Have a terrific night.
I still feel the anxiety of quitting. It's still on my shoulder. I feel like, man, should I have waited? Could I have waited? What would have happened if I was still at work right now and doing this? Okay, what do I do now? I make crazy soap. I started my business in 2017. I started making soap for myself because I have eczema and my skin gets really dry. It's finished. So I started doing some research, playing around in the kitchen, but I never thought about making it a business. It was just an idea to see if people would actually like what I like. I opened up my shop on Shopify. In the first month, I made like $200, and I was so excited to make $200. I told everybody at work, I made $200. It took me like 6 months to sell like 300 bars of soap. But I've always had my job as my security blanket. I worked at National Grid as a meter service technician for 8 years, and I worked overnights. I liked my job. The pay was great. I had great benefits. I would do my night shift, and I would sleep for like 1 or 2 hours and get right back up. I can't remember the last time I slept a full 8 hours. The pandemic made people more hygiene conscious. They're looking for anything to help them, stave off infection. So our sales literally tripled in 1 year. I was in shock. I'm like, oh, this is great. Oh crap, I need help. I was so fatigued trying to stay up during the daylight hours to talk to customers and communicate, or to even batch for production. I was tearing myself apart with my own schedule. And it's either I give up my job or I give up my brand, so which one? And that's what I thought about when I walked into the office.
I'm standing inside the office right now. I'm out of here. I'm not even grabbing my locker.
When I quit, I walked into the office and I made a TikTok. I just quit my $90,000 job. And I wanted people to see that because there was a lot of people that didn't know I worked.
It's been literally like 9 days since I quit my job. And I was saying to myself, well, did I make the right decision? I could be making $54 an hour right now. But ever since I quit, I've been able to be more effective at what I do.
I like to show people what I'm doing at the moment. I'll show myself packing orders. I'll make a video so they see a real person working behind the scenes.
I don't know if you all can still hear me.
Staying alive.
I was worried about speaking, but I think we're okay. Thank you all so much. You were terrific.
Are you ready?
Great.
I think we're okay.
I enjoy talking to customers
log off and continue on with our lives.
At the forefront.
Perhaps dessert now, Mark.
On social.
Really appreciate all your time.
I gotta eat.
And
I want people to feel like they're a part of the brand, and they love
I hope
it.
my husband.
Great to see you all. Thank you so much for being here.
I prep boxes for shipments.
Thank you. It was great to see you.
Thanks so much. Have a great night.
I'm relying on myself here.
Bye, Lauren. Bye,
I
Mark.
have to acclimate my mind. I'm not getting my weekly check. I have to pay for my health insurance on my own now. I will cry when I have to pay my car note next week, but it'll be paid. I get anxious, but I feel good about knowing that I'm working towards something. You know, it's only been 2 months since I quit, but so far so good.